In early October, I opened up a survey putting the fate of post-World War II Europe, Africa, and the Pacific in your hands. Or at least the map part. This was a popular request, but also a more interesting scenario to put together. Similar to World War I, there was no single peace treaty, but rather several. But unlike World War I, there were already Allied decisions agreed upon before the war ended thanks to various meetings, most notably the Potsdam Agreement that arose from the Potsdam Conference in 1945. While they weren't peace treaties outright, it does mean that not everything would have been up for debate in the redrawing of Europe. Some things were just going to happen. Additionally, with the Soviets not even entering the Pacific Theater until August of 1945, there were similarly less things to squabble over in the Pacific Theater after the war. But I did my best to find some interesting things for all of you to vote on across the month of October, especially after the Roman Empire partition video ended up being quite lackluster. While we didn't get as many votes as the Napoleonic Wars Treaty of Paris survey, this one is still a solid second place, so thanks to everyone who voted. But first, it's getting colder outside, at least in the northern hemisphere, and that means I get to enjoy curling up under some blankets to relax and read a book. But sometimes it gets so comfy you really don't want to leave, so you might as well grab a big and interesting book. And that's why this video sponsor is once again Hungry Minds with The Book. The Book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, is like a history and science guidebook combined, containing over 400 pages worth of knowledge ranging from how X-rays work to avoiding poisonous plants to the basics of chess. Essentially, a basic guide for so many areas of human civilization. The texts of knowledge make it a great book for your shelf, while the absolutely beautiful handmade illustrations make this an amazing book for your coffee table as well. The book was the result of a huge Indiegogo and Kickstarter campaign, and with that support they were able to not only make this beautiful book a reality, but consult experts for the information inside and print these illustrations on high quality matte paper and inside a stunningly illustrated cover. There's many great reviews and hundreds of thousands of copies sold, so you can be pretty confident that the book can be a great Christmas gift for either yourself or someone else. After all, the holidays are coming up soon. So buy a copy of the book with the link below now using the promo code CHRISTMASEMPEROR and you'll be on your way. So thanks again to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video. Alright, let's get into the results. First were the questions about how to handle post-war Germany. Obviously, all of Germany's wartime gains were going to be reversed, and the Allied occupation zones over Germany were already going to happen. But there were still several tidbits that needed to be settled. Firstly, what about Austria? In our timeline, Austria was separated from Germany and also occupied by the Allies in 4 separate occupation zones until 1955. But in the first question, you had the option to where maybe Austria stays with Germany. Germany is still in 4 occupation zones, but with Austria as a part of it, since Austria wasn't a wartime gain. But in a 60-40 split, you guys rejected that idea. 56.7% of you guys also voted to still let France establish a protectorate in the Saarland like they did in our timeline for around a decade. Next was a question about the Bakker-Schut Plan, an idea for the Netherlands to possibly annex German territory for its own economic benefit. There were multiple variations on how far the annexations would go, and in the end the Dutch only annexed a few border towns for a few years before eventually giving them back. And while 65.2% of you voted for approving the Bakker-Schut Plan in some capacity, you were all divided on to what extent, so the border town outcome ended up winning with a 44.8% plurality. Continuing the trend of keeping the timeline the same, 58.4% of you guys also agreed Denmark shouldn't annex southern Schleswig. At this point, I was worried we were going to have a repeat of the Roman partition video where all of you just voted the historical reality and nothing ends up changing. But it's the eastern borders where things get interesting. I had 3 different questions for Poland's western, northern, and eastern borders. The western border with Germany was very close, with the Morgenthau border almost chosen, but ultimately the Oder River border succeeded with 34.1% of the vote. However, 70.6% of you decided that Poland gets all of East Prussia, which means Königsberg is being renamed to Królewiec instead of Kaliningrad. The eastern border was a bit more divided, but 49.5% of you decided Poland would have a slightly more generous eastern border with the Curzon Line B proposal, which means Lwów is staying Polish. Next, there were some questions over Italy. Most of their fate was sealed before the war was over, but in our timeline there were minor changes and confirmations established with a peace treaty in 1947. Question is whether you guys changed anything. 69.8% of you agreed that France can still annex small areas along the Italian border like they did in our timeline. However, 46.5% of you decided that Yugoslavia would not only get Istria, but even the city of Trieste. Then 63.4% of you rejected the idea of Allied occupation zones for Italy. When it came to the fate of Italy's colonies in Africa, 44.8% of you agreed to the status quo of Libya being temporarily partitioned between the British and French before eventually achieving independence. Then, while accepting that the British were going to occupy Eritrea before giving it to Ethiopia later on, I gave you guys the chance to alter Somalia's fate. 69.2% of you decided that Italian Somaliland would be partitioned between the British and Ethiopia, with Jubaland returning to British Kenya and British Somaliland being slightly expanded and the rest goes to Ethiopia. Now, the Balkan Axis had most of their borders settled already and merely confirmed with peace treaties in 1947, but Winston Churchill had a silly idea of establishing a Danubian confederation between Austria and Hungary as a neutral independent state. This never happened because, well, it's dumb, but I put the vote up to you for fun, and 72.3% of you agreed the idea was stupid. Thank goodness. Then really the only interesting change I could make was regarding Romania's borders. Transylvania was already going to stay Romanian, and Bessarabia was already going to stay in Soviet hands. What about Southern Dobruja and Banat? Southern Dobruja was taken by Bulgaria and actually kept by them in our timeline, while Banat was an area claimed by Yugoslavia right after World War I, but ended up being seized by Romania. In a very close vote, 32.2% of you decided that Yugoslavia would receive Banat and Bulgaria would keep Southern Dobruja. As mentioned before, the Pacific Theater admittedly had a lot less at stake. 57.6% of you agreed that China would still get Taiwan, and then 57% of you also agreed that China could be given an occupation zone in Japan alongside the US and Commonwealth zones, which, while meaningless in the long term, is still an interesting choice. Like, I imagine if this would happen, they probably would evacuate the zone because of the Chinese Civil War at some point anyway. But the most interesting outcome was the idea of the Allies making some sort of compromise with the Soviets. A unified Korea in exchange for letting the Soviets have an occupation zone over Hokkaido Island. Would the Cold War have a divided Japan or a divided Korea? 54.1% of you thought a Soviet Hokkaido was worth having a unified non-communist Korea. Now, whether this means we'd have a communist North Japan, or perhaps some weird, Ainu Soviet Socialist Republic as a part of the Soviet Union proper that includes the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin, it's hard to say, but either way, this was the most interesting choice you guys made in my opinion. Then to throw the Pacific Allies a bone, what about an idea of partitioning the Japanese islands in Micronesia between all of them instead of just giving them to the United States? It was a bit divided, but 38.4% of you agreed that Australia, New Zealand, and the British should get a portion. Then the final question was over Thailand, a usually forgotten belligerent of World War II. Would they lose land, maybe be partitioned between the British and the French? Nah, 51.8% of you decided to just leave them alone, kind of like how we did. So overall, there weren't a ton of changes, but the ones that you did vote for were actually quite interesting. I saw several comments assuming that this would just result in a bigger Germany and a smaller Russia, but honestly, neither really happened. Instead, you guys just liked Yugoslavia for some reason, I guess. In the meantime, Patreon supporters will get to see full-res hypothetical maps of Europe and the Pacific based off of your decisions, for both 1947 and 1952. So if you'd like to check those out, feel free to sign up. It helps support the channel and keep it going. Thanks for watching. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.